If I was 5 years from retirement, the first thing I'd be asking myself is this: has my strategy actually changed to match where I am now? Because the biggest mistake I see at this stage is people still investing like they've got decades to go. Most people don't realise they've made this mistake because on the surface everything looks fine. Your balance looks solid. Your contributions have been consistent and you feel like you're on track. But underneath that, the plan often isn't set up for what comes next. Over the years, I've seen this pattern quite consistently. People get close to retirement, but they haven't actually shifted from building wealth to preparing to live off it. And those are two very different jobs. When you're 20 or 30 years out, the focus is growth. You can ride out volatility. You can recover from mistakes. Time is doing most of the heavy lifting, but at 5 years out, time is no longer your safety net. And this is where it becomes important, because if your strategy doesn't change, you can walk into retirement with unnecessary risk. Let me give you a simple example. Say you've built up a solid super balance and you stay heavily exposed to growth assets right up until retirement. Now that might work perfectly if markets behave. But if you hit a downturn just before or just after you retire, you don't have the same ability to recover. You're no longer contributing. You're starting to draw income. And that combination changes everything. This is where the mistake really shows up. It's not that growth is wrong. It's that the timing becomes critical. Because what matters now is not just how much you have, it's how stable that money is as you start relying on it. Think of it like this. If you're still fully focused on maximizing returns, you might be taking risks that you no longer need to take. But if you swing too far the other way and become too conservative too early, you might not get the growth you still need. So the mistake isn't one extreme or the other. It's not adjusting the strategy to the stage you're in. And this is where most people get caught out. They either stay too aggressive because that's what got them there, or they pull back too much because retirement feels close. But neither approach is really thought through. What should be happening instead is a shift in focus from building the biggest balance possible to building a structure that can support income. Because retirement is not a number problem. It's a cash flow problem. You're no longer asking, how much can I grow this? You're asking, how do I make this last? And that changes how you think about everything. Your investments, your cash buffer, your timing. And spending is a big part of that. Not just your regular annual costs, but the bigger expenses you've been looking forward to. The overseas trip you've been putting off for years, helping the kids with a house deposit, or finally doing that renovation. These are real numbers, and if they're not in the plan, they can create pressure on the portfolio right at the point when you're most exposed. So when you're thinking about what retirement costs, don't just think about the monthly budget. Think about the one-off expenses that are sitting on your list, because they need to be planned for too. Let's bring this into a real-life example. You might be 5 years out with a good super balance and no major issues. But if your plan hasn't considered what happens if markets fall early, how much you'll actually draw each year, the big expenses you're planning in the first few years, and how your assets are structured to support all of that. You're essentially going in without a plan for the most important phase. And that's where problems start. Not immediately, but over time. Because small mismatches early on create pressure later. And by the time you feel it, your flexibility is much lower. You can't easily go back to work. You can't rebuild the same way. And that's why getting this right 5 years out matters so much. So what should you actually be thinking about? Not just your balance, but how your plan behaves under pressure. If markets drop early, what happens? If your spending is slightly higher than expected, what happens? If that big trip costs more than you planned, what happens? If you live longer than expected, what happens? because this is really about building flexibility. The more flexible your plan is, the less impact those events have. And this is also where it's important to say, this is generally nature, so it's important to consider your own situation, because small differences can have a big impact here. But here's the key takeaway. The biggest mistake 5 years before retirement is not recognizing that the game has changed. You're no longer just building wealth, you're preparing to rely on it. And if your strategy doesn't reflect that, you're taking risks you don't need to take, or missing opportunities you actually need. If you get that transition right, everything that follows becomes much easier to manage. If you don't, it can quietly create problems that are hard to fix later. And if you get to retirement having planned properly, the next 5 years become about living well, not managing problems. That's the difference preparation makes. If you're approaching retirement and want structured guidance rather than figuring this out alone, I work with Australians in exactly that position. You can find details below.